Hi, Bob. So good afternoon. My name is Kernaghan Webb. I am a professor here in the Department of Law and Business in the Ted Rogers School of Management at Ryerson University in Toronto, Canada. You may wonder why I'm adding in all of that, but that's because this is being recorded. And I'm also the director of the Ryerson University Institute for the Study of Corporate Social Responsibility. And it is my pleasure here today to kick things off for an excellent series of interrelated chit-chats with respect to ISO 26000 Social Responsibility Standard, where to from here. I would like to mention that this particular session is supported and co-sponsored by the CSA group, and my thanks to them for their assistance in that regard, as well as by three fine Ryerson University student organizations, and they are listed there: the Corporate Social Responsibility Student Association, the Commerce and Government Association, and the Law and Business Student Association. So for those of you who are here for the first time, I say welcome to you. For those of you who are coming back, welcome back. We have an ongoing series of talks on corporate social responsibility issues here through the Ryerson CSR Institute. And our idea is to have constructive engagement on issues. The concept of social responsibility is referred to in the academic literature as a contested concept, which means there's dispute as to value, underlying motivations behind it, et cetera, et cetera. So it is an area where differences of opinion are expected and lead to very interesting sparks. So all of that is good. The only thing I do ask is that with respect to those engagements that we will have in the course of this discussion here today, that you keep them pointed and brief and simple. And other than that, all will be well. Our organization for today is quite simple. Go through some brief introductions to start matters off, and then we're going to have a kind of largely a chronological series of presentations. I will start things off by talking about the origins and development of the standard, and then pass things over to David Simpson, who will basically describe the standard itself, features of it, and some ways in which the standard is being adopted by different standards bodies around the world, applications also by individual companies and organizations, as the case might be. Then we will have Dr. Anna Maria Thomason from the Canadian Standards Association, and she will talk about next steps in terms of what's happening here in Canada. And then we move to a perspectives part where we have three different individuals with deep experience on related issues, providing their insights on the social responsibility standard. Those being Bob White, who's currently in Mexico and is patching in by Skype. That's his smiling visage there. Dr. Jonathan Fowler, who I will introduce you to him again in a short while, and Howard Dean, giving kind of industry perspectives, consumer perspectives, and other perspectives. Following that, there will be an opportunity for questions and comments from the floor, but I will hasten to add that it is possible for there to be comments and questions throughout. You do not have to wait until the end, but what I would ask you to do is to, if you can possibly arrange it, if you could keep your comments or questions during the presentations down to those ones which I would call hot pursuit. So a hot pursuit question is where there's something that was said immediately before and you didn't quite get it, and you're just seeking some immediate clarification, and save the more sort of speculative commentary type ones for after. So that's the overall structure of the proceedings. And as I say, I will introduce each of the speakers just before they speak. So let us move ahead with the next stage, which is to discuss origins and development. So in order for us to really understand where we are today and where we're going with respect to the ISO 26000 standard, we need to take, as they say, as children these days say, we need to take the Wayback Machine to about the year 2000, because it was in the year 2000 that ISO began to explore the possibility of developing a standard in the social responsibility area. In order for me to really talk about that, I need to give you an extremely brief background concerning ISO itself, and then the related organizations that are part of the ISO family in Canada. And with that, then we can proceed with a more substantive discussion of social responsibility and how the standard develops. So ISO is a non-state body. It's not part of the UN. It's not part of government. But it is an international body that is devoted to the development of standards. They have developed some 19,000 different standards. And many of you in the room will be somewhat familiar with ISO because you'll be familiar with ISO 9001, which is a quality management system standard that a lot of organizations get certified to, or ISO 14001, which is an environmental management system standard. Those are the two ISO standards that have kind of the highest profile among the general public. But suffice it to say that ISO has developed many, many, many other standards, many of them pertaining to the reduction of barriers to trade, and therefore being standards of a technical nature that make it easier for all types of organizations to do activities that span the globe. ISO is a federation of national standards bodies, of which there are some, I think it's around 160 different national member standards bodies around the world. And it's the ISO national standards bodies that at the national level that actually vote on whether a standard will proceed and then whether or not they accept it and allow it to become an ISO standard after it goes through a standards development process. And within Canada, the Standards Council of Canada is the peak body for ISO-related standards and their dissemination in Canada, and also for gathering input from Canadian stakeholders with respect to any ISO standards that are being developed. So it's kind of the connecting entity in Canada. In other countries around the world, there's an equivalent to the Standards Council of Canada. But there's an important point. In some countries, the national standards body has a governmental foundation. That's true in Canada. The Standards Council of Canada is a crown corporation. It's a federal crown corporation. There's a statute called the Standards Council of Canada Act, and everything that the Standards Council of Canada does, it does pursuant to that legislation, and it gets its funding from the federal government. So in Canada, we have a governmental national standards body, and that is true in many other countries of the world as well. But in some countries, the national standards body is not associated with government formally. For example, in the United States, ANSI is the national standards body of the United States, and it is not a crown corporation, the creature of statute of the American government. I would say most of the standards bodies do have a governmental connection. Why is that important? Because you remember I said ISO itself is a non-governmental body. It's a non-state body. It's not part of the United Nations. It's not government. But the national standards bodies that are the members of ISO, many of them do have a governmental connection. You'll see why that's important in a few minutes. Underneath the Standards Council of Canada, in Canada, are a number of different standards development organizations. The one that is most well known in Canada is the Canadian Standards Association. now known as the CSA Group. And you will know the CSA logo because you've seen it on a lot of electrical products and so on, but they do much more than just electrical standards. And Dr. Tomlinson will be giving you a little bit more detail with respect to the CSA Group. But suffice it to say, when talking about the ISO 26000 standard, it was approved as a national standard through a process that was run by the Canadian Standards Association in Canada. So she will tell you more about that later. So that's the background with respect to ISO and the national standards bodies that feed into ISO. A little bit of background with respect to social responsibility, or corporate social responsibility, as some of you may know it as, in the year 2000, because the year 2000 is the year in which ISO started to get interested and involved in the social responsibility area. In the year 2000, here was kind of the state of play. Intergovernmental bodies, like the UN, were struggling to find good traction with respect to a lot of environmental and social issues, because intergovernmental bodies like the United Nations depend upon the consent and approval of governments on treaties and conventions before those treaties and conventions become ratified, approved, and implemented. So the intergovernmental system, the legal system at the intergovernmental level, depends on the expressed approval on a country-by-country basis, on a treaty-by-treaty basis, before any particular treaty becomes law. So for example, the Kyoto Protocol dealing with climate change, the United States never signed on to that Kyoto Protocol. The Kyoto Protocol is a good example of an intergovernmental treaty. And they just said, no thank you, we do not want to sign on. Canada did sign on to that. Then they proceeded to withdraw from it. But I just bring up that as an example of that's the way our intergovernmental public international law legal system works, i.e. not very well, right? Because each state can decide or decide not to approve and adopt any particular standard, or law, I should say. And so as a result, we have a very, I'll be kind and call it a work in progress with respect to our intergovernmental regime applying to environmental issues and human rights issues and worker issues and so on. Because many countries in the world have not signed on to those treaties and conventions, which opens up the space for other sorts of instruments to essentially attempt to address what we would have expected in a normal world for those intergovernmental instruments to address. So what has happened is the UN itself has developed some non-legal instruments, like the UN Global Compact. The UN Global Compact is a set of 10 very general principles. It is not a treaty. It's not a binding law. But individual companies and other organizations can sign onto it. The CEO can sign onto it and say, we agree to adhere to the principles. And that's an example of UN being innovative to say, we can't seem to get the treaties in these areas signed and implemented by all the countries of the world. Is there something else we could do? So in the year 2000, that was something innovative that they had done. The ILO, which is another UN body that deals with labor issues, had come up with the Tripartite Declaration, which deals with a statement of, at a high level of generality, key labor principles. Again, it is not a treaty, it's not a convention, it's not binding law, but it's a way for them to try and get over the threshold problem of states not signing on and agreeing to abide by ILO conventions. So the UN was doing interesting, innovative things, and the OECD, which is another intergovernmental body, but it's an intergovernmental body of the wealthiest countries of the world only, had developed a very interesting guideline document called the OECD Multinational Enterprise Guidelines. Again, not a binding intergovernmental law, but it was a way for them to say, this is what we expect of multinational corporations that are headquartered in OECD countries. So that takes care of the intergovernmental side of things. In addition to that, though, there were a number of other standards that have been developed that are not from government. For example, there is a standard called the Global Reporting Initiative, which is developed outside of government and sets some very interesting metrics for measuring progress with respect to social responsibility issues, and just deals with reporting metrics. The idea is if we can standardize the reporting metrics, then that will allow comparisons between organizations to be much more constructive than everybody using their own individual metrics. So that's an example of a standard that existed and to this day exists. SA 8000 is an example of a standard, certification standard dealing with labor issues developed outside of ISO. But you notice that 8000, it's not an accident that it has the number 8000. It has the number 8000 because it was emulating the ISO standards like 9001 and 14001. But it was a standard developed just to deal with labor issues. And individual companies would get certified to it. Not a governmental body, not an intergovernmental body, but a certification standard. I mentioned ISO 9001 and ISO 14001, and those are standards that are that were big then and are big now. More than 1 million companies or operations around the world have been certified to ISO 9001, and about another 500,000 have been certified to ISO 14001. So these are in the area of social responsibility, but they're just dealing with little parts of it. Quality, labor, reporting, as the case might be. No entity had come up with an overarching standard on this is what social responsibility is as a whole. This is how things interrelate to each other. This is what we mean by social responsibility, and so on. And that's what ISO, that was the space that ISO decided to attempt to address. Their idea was, let's find a way of creating a bridge between all these different individual standards that exist. And because we are the preeminent standards body in the world that is used by organizations around the world, we have a profile and a platform that's going to make a new standard dealing with social responsibility very attractive to organizations, for example, that are already certified to 9001 or 14001 or any of the other standards that ISO has developed. So that was kind of the background of the situation with respect to ISO getting into the area, thinking about it in 2000. Within ISO, there is a body called the Consumer Policy Committee, CAPOLCO. Not Acapulco, a nice place in Hawaii, just CAPOLCO. So that's Consumer Policy Committee. And the ISO CAPOLCO committee within ISO has something called the Global Markets Group. At that time, I worked for the Government of Canada, for the Office of Consumer Affairs, the Chief of Research and Senior Legal Policy Advisor. And I was participating in the ISO CAPOLCO Global Markets Group, and it fell to me, actually, to develop a report on the feasibility and desirability of there being a social responsibility standard. So you're really speaking in a way to person number one in the world to get this whole giant ISO social responsibility process off. It started off with this ISO CAPOLCO Global Markets Group. It started off with a recommendation by me that we should do something in this area, and then this particular report, which was available for public consumption. Then, through my office, we operated an online forum, which would allow consumer and other stakeholders to comment on the draft report, and that was in 2002. That led to a workshop that was held in Trinidad and Tobago that brought in industry, consumer groups, different standards organizations to discuss that report. And a recommendation that came out of that workshop was not that ISO should develop a standard, but rather that ISO should now proceed to have a more formal, broader consultation with other stakeholders other than just the consumer stakeholders. we, the consumer stakeholders, we saw the merit in developing an ISO standard in this area, but we realized that there is labor, there is intergovernmental bodies, there are governments, there are et cetera, environmental organizations, human rights organizations, that all, they should participate in the discussion as to whether or not ISO should develop a standard in this area. And so that's what happened. That was the next step, was over the period 2002 to 2004, a multi-stakeholder advisory group was set up. I was a member of that. And it led to a report, which my fingerprints are all over that as well, which was a kind of a next stage to this ISO proposal feasibility desirability report. Now it was a broader report, and that led to a broader ISO social responsibility conference in Stockholm in 2004, where the opinion of all of the people in the room was, yes, ISO should proceed with the development of a standard in this area. And that led to a technical management board resolution in 2004, and a vote. Remember I said that the actual votes, whether or not a standard will proceed, and then whether it will be adopted, that's done by the national standards bodies around the world. So there was a vote by the national standards bodies, and that vote was positive. And so over the period 2005 to 2010, that was when the ISO Social Responsibility Working Group came into being and actually developed a standard. It took 5 painful years. There were 450 different members of that working group. The majority were actually from developing countries. It was co-convened by Sweden and Brazil, the idea being developing country and developed country. And it was organized into 7 different stakeholder category groups to ensure that there was representation from a diverse set of stakeholders. There were standards people from national standards bodies, but in addition to that, there were governments, intergovernmental bodies, the UN Global Compact participated, the International Labour Organization participated, the OECD participated, and labor participated, consumer organizations participated, environmental organizations participated, etc. And what I want to point out, which is, I think, quite interesting and significant about that is, in my opinion, this was the first time we saw intergovernmental bodies actually kind of lift their skirts from where they had been up until that moment, which was always in intergovernmental forums, developing treaties and conventions, and they actually moved to participate in a non-state standards development process. Quite interesting. I would argue that reflects the fact of a kind of a tacit recognition of the limitations at that point and to this day of the conventional intergovernmental rulemaking process. So they basically said, we need to participate in that ISO process because we think it will allow us to further our objectives through a non-governmental process. So I would argue that was kind of a critical moment in the world of international standards development, when the government side came to the non-government side and participated in a non-government standard. The ILO and the UN Global Compact and OECD all had MOUs in place with ISO, which acknowledged the primordial place that intergovernmental bodies have in the development of international norms. And so they had that. After that, the Global Reporting Initiative also developed and had an MOU with ISO to participate in this process. What's interesting there is that standards that you could argue would be competitors to the ISO standards decided to join and participate in the ISO standards development process. Again, the significance of that, in my opinion, is that there was this recognition by essentially all interested parties around the world that you needed to get on the ISO 26000 development train, because it was essentially potentially going to create something new and distinctive that was going to be valuable to you, whether you were a competitor standards organization, whether you were an intergovernmental body, a governmental body, a labor body, environment, consumer, etc. So the reason why I say it was the years 2005 through 2010 were painful relates back to the fact that never before had this set of people and organizations all got together and tried to hammer out something as contested as the concept of social responsibility. And it was a painful process, believe me. Somewhere during that process, I moved from being in the federal government to joining Ryerson University. And so I was no longer the Canadian governmental representative, but I then proceeded to be the UN Global Compact's representative. So I continued to be involved in the process, and to this day, I am a special advisor to the UN Global Compact on ISO 26000. The kind of the interesting thing is that really in a lot of ways, Canada, there are Canadian fingerprints all over this particular standard. I would say most fundamentally, it's the Canadian way of doing things, right? It is this, is there some way we can sit down and talk type of approach to doing things that is really reflected very nicely in the ultimate process that was developed by ISO with respect to 26000. The only other thing I really want to say about this before I hand things over to David is the interesting thing about the way in which the standard was developed. Each draft of the standard was publicly accessible. The comments that were made by all of the entities that were participating in any national standards bodies, the UN Global Compact, etc., all of those comments on each iteration of the standard publicly accessible, and they are to this day. You can find earlier iterations of the standard as a draft, and you can find all of the comments there. And so it was a very transparent and open process, and assistance, financial assistance was provided to developing country participants so that they were not disadvantaged. There were also language committees set up to allow for people whose first language, mother tongue was not English, to again to follow and get translations and that sort of thing as things went along. So it's a very transparent and open process. Not only were, typically with international standards pertaining to social responsibility, they tend to be coalitions of the willing. What I mean by that is, it's people who are very enthused about an idea, like climate change or reporting or whatever. The only people who come to participate in that standard will be those who think it's a fantastic idea. That was not the case with respect to ISO 26000. There were also I guess you could say hostile. There were hostile parties who really did not want ISO to develop a standard. They were also participating in that standards process, which is a little bit like conventional legal process, legislative processes, right? I mean, if you take a look at Parliament, not everybody's on the same page there. Yes, the Liberals are in power, but the Conservatives tend to be saying no to everything that the Liberals say, and vice versa if the Conservatives are in power. And so there's a different dynamic, a dynamic that's kind of similar to the dynamic of conventional legislative processes in the development of the ISO 26000 process. So after the standard was published in 2010, November 2010, a post-publication organization was set up. I'm a member of that, and our job is to kind of monitor what's happened since that time. And what's happened since November 2010 is that a lot of national standards bodies have adopted ISO 26000 as a national standard. And Anna Maria will tell you more specifically about how that process has proceeded in Canada. David Simpson, who will be the next person speaking, he was the chair of that Canadian process of adopting it here in Canada. Throughout the period 2005 through 2010, there was a mirror committee set up in Canada. So this consisted of industry, labor, government, environment, consumer, people here in Canada who were interested in the topic. And they had an opportunity to hear about, to comment on the draft, and that was funneled back through a set of individuals who were appointed by the Standards Council of Canada to participate in the working group process. David was a part of that. Mary Ellen, who's in here somewhere, was a part of that. Bob White, who's on Skype right now, participated in that. Am I missing anyone else who was in the room? Izzy, well, Izzy did not participate at the international level, but he was, were you the chair of the Mirror Committee? Chair of the Mirror Committee here in Canada. So we have some people who have deep roots on that process all the way through. So that's all I'm going to say in terms of setting the table. And I'm going to pass things over now to David Simpson, who's going to tell you more about the standard itself and its application. So over to